Hi, everyone. My name is Thoele, and I'm an illustrator and graphic designer who's based out of Iowa City. And I work in a wide variety of styles and in all different kinds of media. And I'm excited to share some examples of that, as well as a little bit of my process. I want to send a huge thank you to everyone at the ArtiFactory for helping make this video possible, as well as for putting on all kinds of interesting programming throughout the pandemic and beyond. I grew up in northern Illinois, just outside of Savannah, which is along the Mississippi River. It's in a driftless region, which is an area that the glaciers didn't flatten. So there are all kinds of beautiful limestone bluffs and forest and prairies. I spent a lot of my childhood being outside and exploring all kinds of nature. And every spring at around this time, I would go hunting for morel mushrooms in the woods with my family. We would also occasionally find animal bones in the forest. Skulls and mushrooms are still one of my favorite subjects. When I wasn't outside, I spent a lot of time reading and drawing. This combination of interests has fostered a big interest in illustration, specifically because I love pictures that tell a story. I loved reading Calvin and Hobbes, and I think Bill Watterson's line work is immaculate. Jan Brett's border work and the depth of her illustration is remarkable. John Bauer, Craig Thompson, and Chris Riddle have all also been hugely influential. Recently, I was invited back to participate in a showcase at the Savannah Museum and Cultural Center, and so I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to create a series of paintings based on the landscape of my childhood. I created these gouache and ink paintings based on 6 photographs that I found while going through a box of old pictures with my parents a few months ago, which adds a nice family tie-in to this series. I've really come to appreciate the landscape recently, possibly since I've been living in a much flatter place here in Iowa, possibly because my husband and I adopted a dog that needs a lot of off-leash country time. An art showcase in my hometown was just the push I needed to make a visual homage to the place I grew up. I even had an opportunity to demonstrate my technique at the event, which was very exciting because I really enjoy sharing my process and using it to connect with viewers. I start off with a very faint pencil outline and then bring in light layers of gouache followed by India ink for the stark winter trees in the background. I work in more layers to build up the deeper shadows after that. I've only been working with gouache for a few months. I've been painting with watercolors for a long time and have a lot of experience with that media, but I've really been enjoying the extra opacity and the texture of the gouache, which is a little more forgiving and allows a bit more fluidity with the process. I don't always know what pieces are going to look like when I start. I have a basic idea and outline in my head and a sketch on the paper, but I try to let the materials guide me. And so I'm often pleasantly surprised by certain aspects of a finished piece. I didn't expect how nicely the stylized illustrative trees in the background and their boldness would pair with the gentle washes of color in the foreground. I think this might be my favorite of the 7 pieces that I created for the showcase, and I was very glad that this is the one that I demonstrated at the event. I moved to Iowa City in 2003 to attend the University of Iowa. I've always been interested in a wide variety of things, so it took me a while to decide on what I wanted to focus. I studied Russian and history and psychology before finally settling on art as my focus. And when I decided that that was my central goal, I took classes in as many different media as I possibly could. I studied ceramics and oil painting. I took life drawing and photography and intermediate classes, and I was very excited to learn some bookbinding along the way. Because I didn't finish my BFA, I never felt the need to really fence myself in terms of media or style. At my center, I am an illustrator, but I still explore a lot of different media and techniques in my work. I think this gives me a lot of flexibility and the ability to continue to grow in my creative practice without getting trapped in a rut or getting bored of a style. I like to think that if you view my pieces together, you can see a through line in them. In a lot of different media and styles, I have a clear voice and consistent line work, and all the pieces that I create are clearly mine, whether an oil painting or a digital illustration. With the internet, this is one of the best decades to learn and share things. Instagram is a great way to share art and connect with other artists. There are online classes and video tutorials of pretty much anything that anyone would want to learn. I'm always trying to learn new things and improve my art practice, and one of the ways that I do that is by participating in online challenges. These are set by a lot of different artists on Instagram or Facebook and are open to anyone who wants to participate. They decide the parameters of the challenge and encourage artists to follow it and use a specific hashtag to make everyone's work easy to find. For example, this was the first one that I ever actually completed. It was the ABP Illustrated ABC Challenge, and it was put on by a pocket full of letters. And the goal was to illustrate a letter of the alphabet every day for 26 days. I think these challenges are a great way to build up momentum, an excuse to really stretch and explore ideas that you might not give the time to otherwise. It's also fantastic because you're using the same hashtag as the rest of the group, and so you can see what other people around the world are creating. You have kind of a built-in peer group and community based around working through the same challenge. I think this is also a fantastic exercise in letting go of perfectionism, which I need a lot of practice in. Because the act of creating something every day is as important as the finished product that you create. I also firmly believe that if you do create art every day, it's not all going to be great, but you will discover some fantastic things and different ways of looking at an idea, as opposed to if you sat down only when you had the perfect thought. Just the act of creating and setting aside that time consistently is huge in order to make things that are exciting and keep you interested in coming back every day. A lot of the best pieces in my body of work are based on silly sketchbook drawings that I've made and then realized that I wanted to explore more deeply. Working in a sketchbook and participating in these challenges has become a big part of my artistic process, and I encourage everyone to find or create your own sketchbook challenge. I've always loved music and have been part of the Iowa City music scene for a long time now, from taking photos of bands to creating flyers and posters to working on album art and even playing bass in a few groups. The community that exists around the music scene is wonderful, and I have gotten to know such a range of creative people this way. I have a lot of love for the art of the rock poster, and metal t-shirts are some of the most interesting ones that I own. These three posters all represent my love of the rock poster, marrying the neon intensity of the 80s with magenta and teal and gradients, and the expressive psychedelic lettering of the 60s. I'm also a big fan of balance in my art, from symmetry to balancing super saturated colors in the lettering with the very subdued hues in the central image. I have been lucky enough to be part of the design process for 7 different albums, and they have all been extremely rewarding. It's a lot of practice working with other creative people who all have strong opinions and a lot of ideas to bring to the table. Working through all that to come to a cohesive idea that everyone's happy with is such a puzzle, and I'm a big fan of puzzles. It's really made me enjoy working on collaborations with other people. It's also just fantastic to send something off to the printers and get back something that feels real. It's great to be able to create something that comes back feeling like a final, finished product. Until recently, I worked at the Shimmick before and after school program, and we had a super awesome rock band of 3rd to 6th grade students. They learned songs from all eras of rock and pop, from Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones to Seven Nation Army by the White Stripes, and they performed at several venues in town. Of course, each year we had to have a t-shirt, and I was happy to design a number of them. We wanted them to be consistent across the board so it would feel like a set, and the kids could wear any year's shirt and still fit in with the group. We decided the most rock and roll thing was a black t-shirt with white printing, and this presented a few design challenges. because you want to make sure the t-shirt is very legible from a distance, but it also needs to have that fun energy that kids are going to be happy to wear. And of course, dealing with white printing as your foreground presents its own set of challenges. White needs to print several times to be legible on black, so you have to be careful about small details disappearing, and working with a lighter color as the foreground can cause some legibility issues if you don't plan for it. This was my first experience preparing shirts for screen printing, and it was a great learning experience, and I'm very happy to have this set of designs in my portfolio. A big project that I worked on recently was illustrating and preparing the book What's Their Kingdom for print. It's a nonfiction book all about how much fun it is to search in the woods for mushrooms and fungi to photograph or sketch. I worked with the author, and it was a lot of fun to try to bring her love of the topic to the work, as well as my own experience of hunting mushrooms as a child. Working with kids for over 10 years really got my imagination and goofy side going. I always had a lot of fun drawing silly pictures for the students. It brings such a joy and immediacy to creating art. What I really enjoy is the contrast of a ridiculous idea executed in a serious style. So I love the delicate watercolor on these silly pictures of food behaving badly. This set are all stickers that I had printed from an online company, and I had a great time working with them, and the final product is fantastic. But recently I was able to get a much better printer, and I've worked out a sticker creating technique that I'm able to do from home, which is fantastic and gives me a lot of flexibility of what I can make into a sticker. I can do very limited runs instead of needing to order 1 to 200. This octopus riding a dune buggy is a great example of a lot of aspects of my work. A silly idea that came out of a sketchbook, executing it in a serious style, and then working out the puzzle of the technique. I scanned the image and digitized it, and then I printed it out onto high quality sticker paper. But I decided that I wanted to make the stickers a little more water resistant, because people like to put stickers on bikes and water bottles and bumpers, and I was concerned that the stickers would run if they got wet. I discovered that if you run 2 stickers through the laminator back to back, it laminated only the front of each one, which creates a great water barrier. I actually left one of these stickers outside in the rain and snow for a week on accident, and it was still perfectly clear and just as sticky as it had been when I printed it out. I've been invited to contribute a number of illustrations to the Little Village magazine. Building Love Stories was a cover to an edition of the magazine containing a number of editorials and opinion pieces about buildings in Iowa City. And I brought in a lot of architectural details, stylized, of course, from real places in Iowa City. I try to bring a lot of interesting details into most of my work, so the viewer will have a different experience every time they return. I want my illustrations to reward the audience for looking closely and keep them coming back for another look. The portrait of Gabe's was a great request because I've spent a lot of evenings there seeing live music or just spending time with friends. And I wanted it to feel like a welcoming place, even though it's not the most beautiful building, because it holds a special place in my heart. The small black and white illustrations accompanied letters from the Dear Kiki advice column. It was an interesting challenge to try to bring a little bit of the question asker's story to life in a small black and white illustration. This shows a before and after of a commissioned piece. My sketch stage was created using a non-photo blue pencil to try to get dynamic and fluid lines. And then I finished by digitizing the illustration. These are for a friend's film developing business, which is all run through the mail. So the film canisters being sent off are represented by the parachuting guy, and then the film is developed and born, as it were. It was a lot of fun to put this piece together. This series was created with a lot of planning and pre-production work. I knew I wanted to make a series about the 4 seasons, but I didn't want it to be the most obvious imagery of the seasons. So I spent some time thinking about what each of the seasons meant to me personally. And I did some research into various festivals and traditions that are associated with them. I looked into plants that grow during these times of year. and evoke the feeling of the season. The animals are ones that have traits that I associate with the seasons. Bright, bold, strong lion for the summer, timid, hopeful rabbit for the spring. The crow is picking the fields clean after the reaping, and the majestic deer in the winter. I have prey animals in the parts of the year where people struggle to find food, and predators during times of bounty. After a lot of brainstorming, I worked up a ton of thumbnail sketches trying to decide the positioning of things and which elements would be consistent through the 4 seasons, and then what would be different between the pairs of winter and summer versus spring and autumn. This was the first series that I created mostly digitally, and of course, when you're just starting out, there are a lot of hiccups and difficulties that I ran into because of this inexperience. I would do a lot of things differently during this stage, but I think the planning and pre-production that I did to start out really helped me, because even though I had some technological struggles, I'm still very happy with these finished pieces. My current day job is preparing items and images for screen printing, and this means I work a lot with vectors, which has been a huge learning process. I knew a little bit about how vectors worked and using the pen tool before, but I've grown a lot in this area. Early on in this position, I decided I wanted some outside practice. And so I was inspired to work through this series that's based on the WPA National Parks posters. They have a lot of flat layers of discrete color and a limited color palette, which works great with vectors. And I had some awesome pictures from a trip to Iceland that I didn't quite know what to do with. That epic scenery works out perfectly for this style of poster. Vectors are great because they're just made out of math, so they can be reproduced very, very small or extremely large with no loss of quality, which is fantastic for printing and reproduction. But you're working directly with the nodes and the Bezier curves, which takes a lot of practice. There's a pretty steep learning curve to this technique because it's not necessarily intuitive for someone, even for someone who's been drawing and making visual art for a long time. This series is based on a few sketches from the Inktober challenge. This challenge is to draw a drawing every day for the month of October, which is based on a series of prompts. When I was working through this challenge, I found a theme that was developing unintentionally, which was this idea of magic gone wrong, or the toll that magic takes. That's how I chose these images from that group of Inktober sketches, and I'm now moving forward through a number of iterations to try to get a final series of 13. Here's a sketch that I started with, and then an ink wash painting, and then finally a line drawing, which I will digitally paint next. One of my goals with this series is to bring a lot of motion into a still image. You can see the hair flowing. I'm definitely inspired by movies like Spirited Away or Howl's Moving Castle. I always love the look of anime hair blowing in the wind and when there is something magical happening. This image was inspired by the word overgrown. I've taken this one step further through the process into the digital painting realm. I chose a specific set of colors that I will use throughout the series, and I was trying to think of what color would represent magic in this series. And of course, I went with neon, magenta, and teal because I think those are very magical colors. Here you can see that limited color palette again. I think it really brings them together as a group, feeling like a cohesive set of images. It's also interesting to see how much this one's changed from the ink wash painting to the digital version. I really like how the water looks electric with those bright, vibrant colors. In the Magic Gone Wrong series, I was trying to bring a lot of motion into my images, and in this series of gnomes, tomta in Swedish, I am trying to bring a little bit of a story. In these, there is nothing too complex, roasting a marshmallow, gathering firewood, or feeding the birds, but it shows some of what these gnomes' lives are like outside the confines of the image. I'm hoping to end up with 12 of these and produce a gnome calendar next year. My most recent and probably most ambitious project to date is illustrating and writing a book with my husband. We are setting it in a snowy northern place because we love Norse myths and the scenery of Scandinavia. This project is going to go through a lot of stages and it's still in its very early days. At the moment, we have only outlines and this one image completed. I worked out a lot of thumbnails to really get the framing and blocking nailed down. The way blocking tells a story in well-made cinema is a big inspiration for the planning of this project. In the two images on the top left, we can see the concept of a storyteller telling a tale by an open fire with the shadows behind him representing the story that's being told. You can see in some of these few, you can see in some of these small thumbnails that I explored a few different positions of the figures and a few different stories in the shadow space. I also did a lot of interior design work, trying to figure out what the room would look like. You can see my exploring of housing structure and some reference pictures in the two bottom thumbnails. In the top right, you can see that I am looking into the border concept that we were considering and some takes on traditional Norse knotted animals. Here's the finished poster style page. The story that's being told is the Norse myth of Fenrir and Tyr. Fenrir is a giant wolf and Loki's son, and the gods are afraid of him and try to bind him, but he keeps breaking through every chain. And you can see those chains being broken in the shadow as well as reinforced in the border. Eventually they trick Fenrir and bind him in a delicate ribbon-like chain, but knowing he's been fooled, he bites Tyr's hand off, which you can see in the shadow. I brought a lot of details into this illustration. I want to encourage viewers to look at the image more deeply. My goal is to have such rich details that readers will want to keep looking and the image will reward that level of scrutiny. You can see the steps as I built them up, starting with the very basic sketch to the first stage of line work, bringing in all the colors, and then figures after that. Shading is on another layer, and I feel like it does a lot to add to the atmosphere of the room. And then I added final magical details, and then a paper texture on the top, which really ties the whole image together. We are also exploring how the pages would look laid out as a traditional storybook, with the text block on one page and the facing page being the illustration. At the moment, it's all just filler text, which is lorem ipsum, which is a dummy text that's based on a typesetting tradition. It looks like regular paragraphs, but is meaningless. It allows you to see how your layout will look without actual copy, which you can need either because you don't want to be distracted by what the words are actually saying, or because your copy isn't ready yet. You can see how the border works as a framing device for either the image or the text. And I'm very happy with how this all turned out. I like stories hidden in borders or extra little exciting details. I want them to make the experience as rich as possible for the reader or viewer. Again, thank you very much to everyone who tuned in and to the ArtiFactory for making this presentation possible. I really hope that you'll stick around for the Q&A after.